ORDA Science Webinar, Best Practices Restoring Salmon Populations on February 21, 2023 at 20:03 Universal Time. Recorded by Susan Lingenfulser and organized by Samantha Foster in Microsoft Teams.
I had mentioned before that we have a question up on your screen, and I'd be interested to know what you all think the answer is for the most abundant salmon species or salmonid species in the Columbia River Basin. We have a few guesses in there. I enjoyed Sarah's answer depends on whose history you go by, but feel free to drop that in. This data or these data were found on the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission, and I also dropped that link in the chat too. Lots of good resources there to learn a little more. But our speaker, Toby Kock, will also be giving us some information on this topic as well. So I'd encourage you to take a look at your settings, and for the presenter, I suggest turning off cameras and your microphones. We'll have the presentation, and at the end, you can either put questions in the chat feature, which is that little bubble that says chat up at the top of your screen, and we'll go through those at the end of the presentation.
Welcome to today's ORDA Science Webinar. Options include A. Sockeye, B. Chinook, C. Chum, D. Steelhead, E. Coho. Learn more about the importance of salmon at https://critfic.org/fish-and-watersheds/Columbia-river-fish-species/Columbia-river-salmon.
All right, so with that, I only see a few answers in here, but a few folks have gotten it right. It is Chinook is the most historically abundant species. And I'm sure Toby's going to mention some more along these lines throughout his presentation. Let's see.
ORDA Science Webinar Series, Restoring Salmon Populations in the Upper Columbia River Basin, Following 8 Decades of Absence, by Toby Kock, U.S. Geological Survey. Disclaimer: the findings and conclusions in the webinar are those of the presenter and do not necessarily represent the views of DOI's NRDAR program, the department including the trustee bureaus, or the United States. Although some of the presenters may be employees of government agencies, the ideas described herein do not necessarily reflect the policies of those agencies, and no official endorsement should be inferred on NRDAR.
So with that, I'm going to switch over and introduce Toby. All right, going to navigate to a different screen here. So Toby is a supervisory research fish biologist in the USGS Western Fisheries Research Center. His team works on fish passage, survival, and reintroduction studies with Pacific salmon throughout the Pacific Northwest. Toby received a bachelor's degree in biology from Pacific Lutheran University and a master's degree in fishery resource from University of Idaho in 2003. And you all know we asked for a fun fact. So for Toby, after this presentation, he's going to be boarding a plane with his family for a trip to Arizona to attend the Seattle Mariners spring training game. So Toby, there are many baseball fans within this ORDA community. So there's probably some folks jealous of you right now. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn off my camera, but I'll do a quick sound check for you.
Jo Ellen is a long, straight-haired woman wearing a striped shirt and glasses with a plant and artwork in the background.
So that you can get going.
Toby is a clean-shaven man with no hair wearing a plaid button-down with a blurred background.
Okay, can you hear me good, Joe?
Yes.
All right. So thank you for the introduction. And let's see here. I'm actually going to turn my camera off.
Logos include the U.S. Department of the Interior United States Geological Survey, USGS, and Upper Columbia United Tribes, UCUT. Tobias Kock, Supervisory Research Fish Biologist, Western Fisheries Research Center. February 21, 2023. U.S. Department of the Interior and U.S. Geological Survey.
Okay, you should be seeing my presentation full screen now.
Yes, looks perfect.
Oh, all right, great. So yeah, we actually have kind of spitting snow here right now. We've had a couple of power outages in the last 24 hours. And so I'm looking forward to heading to sunny Arizona and watching the first Seattle Mariners spring training game. So that was definitely my fun fact. Thank you for attending this virtual presentation. And I'm going to be talking to you about a large-scale salmon restoration effort that's currently underway to return anadromous salmon, so Chinook salmon, steelhead, sockeye salmon, to the blocked area of the upper Columbia River. That's the area upstream of Grand Coulee and Chief Joseph dams. We'll talk more about those as we get into the presentation. The main thing to understand is this effort is being led by UCUT. You see the emblem over here to the top left of the presentation. That's Upper Columbia United Tribes. I'll talk more about UCUT throughout this presentation and a lot of their efforts. I'll also talk a little bit about some of the work that my colleagues and I in the Western Fisheries Research Center are doing to support UCUT in their effort. And so for the first slide, this slide shows the Columbia River Basin in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. So you can see that the Columbia and Snake Rivers flow primarily through Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and British Columbia. The Columbia Basin does include the periphery of other states such as Montana and Wyoming, but primarily we're talking Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and British Columbia. This map shows all of the dams that are in place. At each location, you can see that a pretty vast number of dams that have affected connectivity and fish passage throughout the basin. And for today, we're going to be talking about this area I've shaded in yellow, the Upper Columbia Basin, and we're going to be talking specifically about Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee dams. Just a quick side note here, there are efforts to return salmon and steelhead ongoing right now on both sides of the border. So Canadian First Peoples or tribes are working on this with stakeholders up there. I'm not going to be getting into that territory. We're just going to be talking specifically about work that the Upper Columbia United Tribes are doing in America. For the current presentation. And so to kick this off, I grabbed a screenshot of this from www.ucut.org. That's the Upper Columbia United Tribes website. And it talks just briefly about how the loss of salmon wounded the indigenous people. And so it says, and I think this is a pretty powerful excerpt here, the Columbia River Basin was home to 22 indigenous communities. Salmon are sacred to the native peoples of the Northwest. The loss of salmon changed the way we live, impacting our religion, lifestyle, culture, economy, and health. When salmon were blocked from our waters in the Upper Columbia, tribes and First Nations did not receive restitution and have not to this day. Still, a century-wide schism exists between our heritage and our modern society. And so if you look at the middle section of this text, to change the way we live, impacting religion, lifestyle, culture, economy, and health, you can see why the Upper Columbia United Tribes are really working to return salmon back to this region and why it's so important to them. And so just to talk a little bit about, the history of salmon in this area. Historically, the Upper Columbia Basin comprised about 60% of the main stem habitat for salmon in the Columbia River Basin. Something like 1,100 miles of habitat exist upstream of Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee dams. And as salmon were present throughout this region, you could imagine that they were historically very important to the tribes who depended on them for subsistence. And specifically, the next slide is going to talk about these two areas, Kettle Falls and Spokane Falls. These are areas where salmon and steelhead congregated and where the tribes return to every year to harvest and to celebrate. And so on the left side of this slide and my slides throughout this presentation, there's this shot of a fisherman fishing downstream of Kettle Falls. On the left side of this slide, there's two pictures from Kettle Falls showing tribal fishermen fishing. And then this is a schematic of Spokane Falls on the Spokane River. It's a primary tributary to what is now Lake Roosevelt, upstream of Grand Coulee Dam. And you can see this is a large encampment on the Spokane River. These are areas that salmon would return to every summer and fall. They would migrate upstream and encounter either Kettle Falls or Spokane Falls. These were very hard for them to navigate. You can see a fish trying to jump over Kettle Falls here. And so they would essentially concentrate just downstream of these areas by the thousands, and they became areas where fish were very susceptible for harvest, and they thus became prime areas for the tribal peoples to meet, to harvest, to celebrate, and they became obviously spiritually and culturally important. This picture in the middle shows two very large Chinook salmon. You know, it took a very large fish to try to navigate up through these falls. And so some of the largest fish in the basin were found in some of these headwater areas. We'll talk a little bit more about in the next few slides about Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee Dam and their construction. You can see they sit on the main stem Columbia River, and you can imagine that when they were constructed in the 1930s to 1950s, that they essentially functioned as a faucet to turn off the salmon supply to this upper Columbia Basin. They were not built with fish passage. And so since the time those projects were closed, there have not been salmon back upstream of the dams. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those two dams and their construction and some of the benefits that they provide to society. And so this is a screenshot looking upstream at Grand Coulee Dam. I'll talk a minute in a bit about kind of when it was constructed. I think suffice to say this is one of kind of the most significant concrete structures in the world. At one time, it was the largest concrete structure in the world. It is visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year. It impounds Lake Roosevelt, which extends upstream 150 miles. Something like 2 million people visit Lake Roosevelt and Grand Coulee each year, either to see the dam or to recreate up in the dam. During the summer, water is spilled in the evening over this spillway. A shallow white flow goes over, and they actually project a laser show, about 30 or 45-minute laser show onto this that visitors can attend. And so it's really a modern marvel, just in terms of engineering and construction. And Grand Coulee and Chief Joe, which we'll talk about in a minute, are the first and second largest hydropower facilities in the United States. There's some really great images of the Grand Coulee construction. If you get online and search those, there's some really, really good books that have been written on it. I'll talk more about those in my final slide. But Grand Coulee was constructed over about a 10-year period from about 1933 to 1942. The final generator was added to the complex in 1980, which made it the largest hydropower complex in the United States. And as I already mentioned, it eliminated salmon and steelhead from about 1,100 miles of habitat upstream, and it impounded Lake Roosevelt, which is approximately 152 miles long. There was no fish passage included in the design of Grand Coulee Dam. Chief Joseph Dam is located about 50 miles downstream of Grand Coulee, 82 kilometers. It was completed in 1955. Because there was no fish passage at Grand Coulee, there was no fish passage attempted at Chief Joseph Dam. It is currently the second largest hydropower producer in the United States. And so collectively, Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee block approximately 57% of the historic salmon and steelhead habitat in the Columbia River main stem. So these are very substantial projects. They have affected connectivity to a very substantial amount of habitat within the basin. This is an image that was taken in 1941. It is the local tribal chiefs looking at Grand Coulee Dam. In the background, Grand Coulee is almost completely constructed at this time. I didn't add any text to this slide, and I think the one point I want to make before I proceed is if you don't remember anything else from this presentation, remember this picture. I think this says an awful lot about just the situation as it existed in 1941 and really as it still exists today. And that's really, my title gets back to more than 8 decades of absence. You know, the salmon and steelhead situation upstream of these projects really hasn't changed in the last 8 decades. And so we're just starting to see some of those things change today. The Upper Columbia United Tribes, this is kind of a light background. You can see just in general, Lake Roosevelt is located here kind of in the middle of the map. The organization is a combined entity of 5 member tribes in the United States. It includes the Colville tribe, the Spokane tribe, the Kalispell tribe, the Coeur d'Alene tribe, and the Kootenai tribe. You can see that they collectively manage and influence millions of acres, interior lakes, dams, and reservoirs. And so they have a lot of responsibilities and a lot of influence in the Upper Columbia region. If you go to their webpage, I'll reference this at the end of the presentation as well, UCUT.org. You can click on these little vignettes that talk about different aspects of what they're working on. But I think, if you visit that site, it will become very clear to you that the primary objective or goal for the UCUT currently is restoring salmon populations in the Upper Columbia Basin. The majority of these vignettes deal with restoring salmon and steelhead in the Upper Columbia Basin. Even, some of the drop-down menus are associated with salmon reintroduction.
UCUT.org vignettes include Phase 2 Implementation Plan. 1. Testing feasibility of reintroduced salmon in the Upper Columbia River Basin. 2. Restoring salmon into the Upper Columbia River Basin. 3. Salmon reintroduction upstream of Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee dams. 4. Site preparation effects on vegetation, tree growth, and ungulates. 5. Fish passage and reintroduction. 6. Frequently asked questions. Salmon reintroduction upstream of Chief Joseph and Grand 7. Columbia River Treaty. And 8. Kalispell Tribe of Indians, Northern Pike.
And so I highly encourage you after the talk to visit this site and see some of the information that's there. UCUT embarked on this 4 phases of reintroduction sometime after about 2010 and in the early 2010s. And basically they've laid this out in 4 phases. Phase 1 has complete. It wrapped up in 2019. In the next few slides, I'll talk to you about that. And we're currently just getting into phase 2, which is experimental pilot scale salmon reintroductions and interim passage facilities. Phase 2 is estimated to take approximately about 20 years to complete. And so really the presentation today is going to focus on phase 1 and a little bit on phase 2. If all goes well with phase 2, eventually the transition would be into phase 3, where there would be construction of, permanent fish passage facilities and propagation or hatchery facilities, and then monitoring, evaluation, and adaptive management activities to, improve management of populations throughout the region and ensure that they persist. And so first I want to talk about some of the phase 1 highlights and conclusions. And the first one is that some of the best cold water habitat in the entire Columbia River Basin is located upstream of Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee dams. This picture is actually taken from the Columbia River headwaters in Canada. This is taken from the Sandpool River in Washington State, which is a primary tributary just upstream of Grand Coulee. These are pristine cold water areas. And when you think about things like climate change, in a warming climate, these are areas that are going to be very important for salmon and steelhead in the future to be able to persist if they can access these areas.
Stream restoration includes images of log removal, a forest landscape, tree planting, a riverbed, a section of stream with filtering, and an overhead photo of a forested stream area.
I know you all are interested in restoration. Tom Belladou from the Coeur d'Alene tribe provided several photographs here of some of their restoration activities. The Upper Columbia United Tribes have been doing stream restoration in preparation for eventually getting salmon and steelhead back up to these streams for about 2 decades. I mean, it's a long-term work. They've put a lot of time and money into these efforts. And so a lot of this foundational work in preparing the rivers and streams for the return of salmon has been on a much longer time frame than just the phase 1, which was essentially 2015 to 2019. As part of that phase 1 study, they They examined the habitat. They used models to try to understand how much habitat was available, how much quality habitat was available. And you can see that they estimated that, you know, somewhere between 700 and about 1,600 miles of habitat would be available for the various species, from spring Chinook salmon, fall Chinook salmon, sockeye, steelhead. And you could see that they estimated that the habitat could produce large numbers of adults eventually, more than 2,000 steelhead, a few hundred spring Chinook, almost 85,000 summer and fall Chinook, over 200,000 sockeye, adult sockeye returns, and that Lake Roosevelt itself could support up to 49 million sockeye smolt for rearing. So the capacity for this habitat in the Upper Columbia River is really staggering. You know, some of my colleagues have referred to this as the mother of all reintroduction efforts, and I think that is really a good characterization. You know, you're talking about potentially restoring habitat and salmon runs at an unprecedented level compared to previous efforts. And so if that occurs, it definitely has implications for kind of the long-term outlook of salmon in the Columbia River Basin. This graph shows Columbia River Basin salmon harvest from 1865 through the early 2000s. You can see that in general, we've been on a long-term decline. And so if you can add hundreds of thousands of fish back to the basin, you can potentially start to see that trending back upstream. That obviously has implications for people in the Upper Columbia region. It has implications for the Columbia River Basin, but it also has implications for other species. For example, killer whales or orcas. One of their primary food sources is Chinook salmon. And so, you know, groups like the Orca Task Force are really getting behind this restoration in the Upper Columbia because they see the potential for that restoration to provide positive impacts to their species of interest as well. One of the more exciting pieces of the phase one activity are these cultural fish releases. And so these cultural fish releases typically are comprised of small numbers, so 20, 30, 40, 50 adult salmon being transported upstream of Grand Coulee and Chief Joseph Dam and released. Some of those fish are tagged to track to learn. But really, there are opportunities for the tribal people and non-tribal people to get together to be a part of providing access for salmon initially during the phase one activities and starting to generate excitement to get people back in touch with having salmon again in the blocked area of the Upper Columbia. And if you go online and search salmon restoration Upper Columbia River, there are literally dozens of articles that talk about some of these efforts, and it's really interesting. Literally, there's bucket brigades lined up with people handing buckets. In this case, these are juvenile salmon going downstream. This is into Hangman Creek in Washington. But this is a very exciting aspect of the initial efforts to return salmon. These pictures were taken in Spokane in August of this past year. The American Fisheries Society had their annual national meeting in Spokane. And so the Spokane tribe arranged this cultural fish release to coincide with the AFS meeting. And so you can see hundreds of people attended. Many tribal people were there. And this is a fish truck. I think 150 adult Chinook were released over the course of several hours into the Spokane River. And so, again, these efforts are showing up on newsreels, they're showing up in newspaper articles, and they are generating a lot of excitement. In addition to generating excitement, I talked about some of the juvenile releases where they were releasing juvenile salmon with pit tags in them just to see what kind of survival rates those fish experience as they outmigrate through the main stem Columbia River. And they're actually getting some adult returns back. And so this is a article from this last July, one of the pit tag fish that was released a few years ago. They tracked it moving back upstream to the Columbia River. So there's pit tag antennas located in Columbia River dams. They could see that this fish was coming. Eventually, they were able to get it from the hatchery facility where it was collected and return it to Hangman Creek where it was released. And so some pretty exciting developments even from those cultural fish releases. In summary, the phase 1 effort resulted in some important documents that were developed. This is a risk assessment that my colleague Jill Hardiman led that looked at things like disease risk to resident species in the blocked area, what donor stocks would be best used to make the reintroduction. There's a whole phase 1 report that UCUT put together that's available on the UCUT site. And then there's some journal articles that are out there. This one's on habitat availability upstream of Grand Coulee Dam. There's one that was recently released for the cultural fish releases. And ultimately, the conclusion from phase 1 was that reintroduction is feasible. There was enough evidence to support moving forward. And so that's really kind of where we're at right now. We're just moving into phase 2, and that's just getting going. And so I'm going to talk to you just briefly here in the presentation about some of the phase 2 activities. And so in phase 2, UCUT is experimented in doing experimental pilot scale salmon reintroduction, so releasing both juveniles and adults in the blocked area, tagging those fish so that they can learn how fish are distributing, how they're moving, when are they moving, what kind of survival are they experiencing, where are they congregating near dams, so that eventually interim fish passage facilities could be developed, and ultimately in phase 3, where should they construct permanent fish passage facilities. And so I'll take a few slides just to talk about some of the phase 2 activities that are currently underway. Just briefly, again, Grand Coulee and Chief Joseph are up here. This reintroduction is going to face some significant challenges. You can see here there are 11 dams in the main stem Columbia River between Bonneville and Grand Coulee. So obviously there's fish passage concerns and fish survival concerns at those projects. This is really a gauntlet for salmon and steelhead to move up and downstream as a result, not only of the dams, but also the predators that are in the system. You have non-native northern pike located upstream of Grand Coulee. In the main stem downstream of Chief Joseph and upstream as well, you have smallmouth bass, walleye, pike minnow. There's a lot of fish out there that like eating salmon. There's also a burgeoning population of avian predators. And so there are a lot of challenges to this. And so part of the phase 2 activities is trying to understand what survival rates are fish experiencing at each of these projects as they migrate downstream, and what survival rates are they experiencing in reservoirs from predators and other sources of mortality. Upstream of Chief Joseph Dam, there's 5 dams. 2, obviously, Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee on the Columbia, and 3 on the Spokane, Little Falls, Long Lake, and 9 Mile Dam. This is the middle dam, Long Lake Dam on the Spokane River. And so these last 2 slides are really kind of priming you for the pilot study that we're currently working on with UCUT that I'll talk about in the next slide here. And so this is a 3-year study to evaluate downstream migration and survival for juvenile Chinook salmon. The schematic here shows our primary study area. And so you can see I've identified with open circles the dams, the important dams in the system, as well as other sites where we have telemetry receivers located to give us information on reach-specific survival throughout the study area. I've shown release locations. So these are areas where we're releasing tagged fish. And so this study just kicked off last spring, 2022. In 2 weeks, we have field crews that are heading back up to the region to start deploying sites for year 2 of the study. So I don't have a lot of information to present. I'll just talk briefly about our phase 2, about our year 1 of our pilot study. You can see that we released about 5,300 Chinook salmon from March to early May of 2022. All of those fish had a pit tag in it, which you can see here on the left side of the picture, and about 750 of those fish also had acoustic transmitters to give us better information on fish movement patterns. And so you can see how that broke down. And we're really just collecting pilot level information on how fish are approaching dams, how are they passing dams, how are they surviving dams. This is a screenshot taken from Grand Coulee Dam, and we're trying to describe where fish are concentrating near the dam. In this case, you can see that nearly all of the tagged fish that arrived in the forebay were detected at some point over here near the right bank of the dam. And so if you think ahead to eventually developing, preliminary passage structures or permanent fish passage structures, data such as this will be very useful for helping to cite where those structures are located. We're also getting information about when are fish passing the dam. So this is from March to late June of 2022. You can see the bar graph showing when fish passed seasonally during the study period and how passage was related to things like river flow and reservoir elevation, as well as other covariates such as dam operations. We have residence times in specific reaches. And so there's a lot of useful information that's going to come from this pilot study. Simultaneously, UCUT is working on developing concepts for fish passage at these projects. And this is really an area where we're providing a lot of support. My colleagues and I have a lot of expertise in evaluating fish passage structures. This is the whoosh or the salmon cannon technology. We've worked with that, innovative technologies in the past. This is a screenshot looking downstream at a dam with different fish collection alternatives and evaluating which of those are more attractive. We've completed some multi-year or some review studies looking at what factors affect performance of surface collectors. These devices are deployed in the forebays of high head dams to collect juvenile salmon and transport them around downstream and around the dams. We've done review articles on trap and haul and made recommendations, for best practices and identified critical knowledge gaps. And so we're working closely with UCUT on developing some of these concepts and trying to hopefully eventually get some experimental technologies in to try to collect fish and facilitate passage at these projects. And so that really wraps up kind of the phase one and the brief snippet into the phase two activities. Certainly those results, what we learned, what UCUT learned in phase one, what we are learning, what UCUT learned in phase two, which again is expected to last for about 20 years, is going to inform how they will proceed into phase three and hopefully ultimately into phase four of this effort. And so really just looking ahead again at phase three, they're going to be looking to construct permanent fish passage facilities and developing propagation or hatchery facilities that can be used to produce juveniles that could be released every year and really support long-term salmon populations in the Upper Basin. There is a large number of partners and stakeholders who are working with them on this effort. The Army Corps of Engineers owns and operates Chief Joseph Dam. The Bureau of Reclamation owns and operates Grand Coulee Dam. Vista Corporation owns and operates the 3 dams on the Spokane River. Those are certainly important partners to UCUT, as are other such as NOAA Fisheries and BPA Bonneville Power Administration, WDF&W, and Fish and Wildlife Service. So there's a large team who's working on this. There's funding coming in from a large number of sources. And really, this is an effort that we're really seeing getting a lot of momentum and a lot of inertia moving in the right direction.
Additional partner and stakeholder logos include UCUT logo, USGS, the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, Bureau of Reclamation, Coeur d'Alene Tribe, Avista, Bonneville Power Administration, Spokane Tribe of Indians, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Funding partners include Upper Columbia United Tribes, U.S. Geological Survey, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Washington State Legislature, Washington State Department of Ecology, Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, Spokane Tribe of Indians, Coeur d'Alene Tribe, Washington State Office of the Columbia River, Avista Corporation, Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and NOAA Fisheries.
And so before I open this up for questions, again, I would encourage you to go to ucut.org and just spend some time there. There is a lot of information, not only on the organization itself, but on different aspects that they're currently focused on with the reintroduction effort. There's also some really good books on Grand Coulee Dam, you know, some of them, you know, talking about the people and kind of the culture at the time it was built. And so I would encourage you, you know, if you really want to become more informed or get some of the backstory in this, to read some of those books. There's some really interesting information in those. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and be happy to take any questions.
A screenshot of the UCUT website and list of books on Grand Coulee Dam include Grand Coulee Dam, A River Lost, The Columbia Basin Project, Grand Coulee, B Street, Hail Columbia, Third Power Plant, The Mightiest of the All, The Grand Promise, and The Dam. Joe Ellen speaking.
Toby, thanks so much. You're welcome to raise your hand or put a question into the chat for Toby. Lots of interesting information provided. So feel free to come off camera too, if you wish. I did drop in the www.ucut.org link in. I know folks, if you join late after that post, it doesn't show up, but looks to be an interesting website, like Toby mentioned.
Toby speaking.
And I just added my email address to the chat as well.
Great. Well, I'll start with a question. Toby, you had maybe a third of the way into your slide deck. There was estimates of fish for the different stretches of river. And I was just curious, were you a part of those estimates, or can you describe a bit on how those were calculated?
So yeah, so that was calculated. I was not personally involved in that. So I mentioned Joe Hardiman, my colleague. We were peripherally involved with that, but that was really work that the UCUT was primarily leading. They had consultants who were helping them out, and so they were using things like life cycle models and habitat availability models to make predictions for how many adult and juveniles could be supported by the various habitats throughout the sections of the basin.
Yeah, it caught my attention. I was thinking some of our NRDA economists, they may already be aware of that particular report, but it's certainly something that comes up when we think about restorations within NRDA.
Yeah, so that, and I would direct you to the phase 1 report that's on the UCUT site that really outlines, kind of lays out their results in relation to those habitat availability and ultimately salmon production estimates.
Great. We may have a quiet crowd today. I don't see anyone typing, but we'll wait for folks here and see if something else comes up. Yep. Or if you want to come off. Oh, Stephen.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Just to amplify a little bit on what Toby said. Some of these kind of post facto assessments of the intrinsic potential of habitat, you know, they're happening decades, you know, in this case, almost 100 years after the extirpation of the fish. But it is kind of an indirect way to quantify what was lost. And at some point that could be translated into some kind of dollar value, although tribes are resistant to make it that simple. But for damage assessment, you know, DARP cases, those studies could be of interest and may be useful in the future. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah was kind enough to drop in the phase 1 report into the chat for folks. I see Michael has his hand up. Go ahead.
Hi. I've been involved kind of in a tertiary manner with this for decades, starting kind of from when I was working on the LWA in Olympic, and moving now. I work at Lake Roosevelt, and we're kind of working on sort of the same issues. But the one thing that always stands out to me when we have these meetings about Chief Joseph and Lake Roosevelt is nobody ever brings up fish ladders in the term of like a spiral staircase or like a fire escape type fish ladder. Like I think, what was it, 5 years ago, somebody said that a fish ladder at Lake Roosevelt would run all the way to Chief Joseph. And I laughed at them so hard I had to turn off my microphone. But we keep looking at these whoosh systems and at gathering them at the bottom and transporting them to the top, when we could just be looking at building essentially a spiral staircase next to the powerhouse at Grand Coulee, and basically a zigzag type structure on the, I guess, the south side there, at Chief Joe. And I mean, yes, they'd be huge, massive, expensive structures, but they would stand the test of time and do the job without having to worry about some sort of finicky technology. I just don't know why this is never part of the discussion.
Well, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I would say in general, there is, there are a group of fish passage engineers, who have become very well informed on, how high and how fast, can you build can you have ladders that salmon can successfully pass? Some of those lessons from decades ago, we're learning more in recent years. And so, like on the Clackamas River, there's an adult fish ladder now that's 2.5 miles long. That's very successful at passing fish. But we're also, and so I agree with you that, that might be possible. We're also at a time and place where there are a lot of emerging fish passage technologies out there. I mean, the Department of Energy is providing a ton of funding to developing innovative passage solutions. And so really, I think, kind of one of the things that UCUT and other stakeholders are going to have to do in the next few years is really sort out what are the trade-offs between, building very, very expensive structures like you're talking about, and that may have a high probability of success, or potentially using less expensive structures that, we're not as confident in their ultimate success. And really, I think that's kind of one of the geniuses in their phase design here. Is phase 2 is really designed to test some experimental technologies. And so hopefully in the next 20 years, if they do implement some of these new technologies, we'll have better information going into phase 3 to really inform what options are really provide the highest likelihood of being successful.
Well, and I'm really excited to see something work, because we still have viable genetics in Lake Roosevelt from, populations that have been trapped behind the dam for going on 80 years now. But I mean, we still have a sockeye population that is behind the dam. We still have the white sturgeon population. We still have the red band trout population. And these genetics, if they have access and can re-access that anadromy, could self-establish.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit more. I'm hopeful too, and I think the real impact of the recent fish releases, despite their small scale, um, it's given the tribe some hope. And on a point of cultural sensitivity for people unfamiliar with this challenge, I mean, the tribes are not happy about the status quo and the fact that it's persisted for about 80 years without any real movement towards innovation or experimentation on the part of the Corps or the Bureau. And so Toby's right. It's really a turning point in that DOE is making funds available to different vendors in the private sector who are developing different approaches. And maybe we'll get lucky here. Maybe there'll be some way to pass fish that won't require tens of miles of concrete. But the tribes are pragmatic, and I think where they're at is, they just want to see us take a hard run at this. They understand this may or may not work in the end. But so far so good, and you won't know till you try. So that's kind of where we are. Thanks.
Other questions? I don't see any new ones in the chat. I'll ask another one, Toby. When you're talking about the reintroductions and knowing that, you just have the data from last year, it's the pilot. What are some of the long-term monitoring practices that will be used in these other phases? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so two of the most important are, so I showed the image of the juvenile salmon with the pit tag, and so those pit tags allow you to identify individual fish. And so the advantage of those is you can tag a fish when it's young and out migrating, and when it returns as an adult, you know how long it was gone for, you know where it came from. And so pit tag technology is going to be very important. The other one that's going to be important is genetic studies. So they're planning to use parentage-based tagging methods up there, and so eventually, I think as part of their phase 2 activities, fish that arrive at Chief Joseph Dam, they're going to be able to take a tissue sample and ultimately, be able to know what parents was this fish produced from, where did it spawn and things like that. And so those are some of the kind of long-term techniques that they're, just starting to wade into using up there.
A final comment in regards to damage assessment. Out here in the Northwest, we're blessed with some large scale, well-funded restoration programs. But restoration is expensive, and part of the opportunity here, restoring anatomy to the blocked areas, is that there's a lot of historic habitat up there that's in better shape than habitat in other areas where money is being spent on restoration. So that's part of the promise of this endeavor. Thanks.
Thanks for that. Ted Millett posed a question, and he says he's hesitant to ask this question, but is it worthwhile to consider how to offset any corresponding energy losses if dams come out and net effects of carbon emissions?
And I'm going to quickly defer on that. That is, I'm a research fish biologist. I deal with fish passage and survival, and so I am not the right person to answer that question.
Yeah, we're the fish people. We're not economists, and on a, in close proximity with lower snake dams, that conversation and controversy is kind of raging, hydro versus carbon, et cetera. But for us, what we're trying to do with the UCUTs is just determine whether or not a system of this scale with these magnitude of these challenges, the length of the lake, height of the dam, all that, whether it's possible, and so far, despite small numbers of fish being released, we've gotten some signs of encouragement. And as to what it may all cost later, well, that's for other people to determine and then for policymakers to decide.
Susan speaking.
Hi, Joe had to drop off, so I'm taking over for any other questions or discussion.
Right. This is Mike Smoke again. I had one more question, and this kind of goes towards fisheries policy. As I understand our agreement with Canada, when we originally started building dams back in the heyday, if there were salmon above Chief Joseph, then they had to start building fish passage at their dams. Or paraphrasing it heavily here. I'm not sitting here looking at the agreement, but does this small scale introduction trigger any of that international agreement or law at all?
So I don't want to get super deep into this, but just to clarify, you said if they get above upstream of Chief Joseph, I think it's actually upstream of Grand Coulee, and certainly the UCUT is meeting in relation to the Columbia River Treaty, and they're meeting with their Canadian counterparts, and so there's a lot of discussions that are ongoing about that. But I think in general, yes, you're right. If salmon populations become established and are presumably entering Canada in the future, then that would trigger ultimately developing fish passage at those dams as well. But that's another whole ball of wax. So, that's another layer on this whole concept.
Phase 5.
Yeah,
Phase 5, yeah.
Yeah, Canadians aren't required to do anything until we get passage happening down here. But the good news is, despite that lag in time, the UCUTs are speaking with their cousins in the First Nations, and the Canadian version of the CRITFIC, Columbia River and Tribal Fish Commission, has been very active on this issue. So there is coordination going on behind the scenes, and I think there'll be political support down the road.
Looking at the chat, Sarah had a question. She posted a 2017 publication wondering if it was related work. It was by Hardiman and others, risk assessment for the reintroduction of anadromous salmonids upstream of Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee dams, northeastern Washington. It was a USGS report.
Yeah, that is, so I had a slide in my slide stack, slide 21, that had 3 documents on it, and so that's the document on the left. That was part of the phase 1 activities.
Any other questions? All right, seeing nothing in the chat and hearing nothing. Toby, I want to thank you for a fantastic presentation and for all the participants, a really good discussion. I myself am looking forward to phase 1. I'm hoping I'll still be around through all the phase 2 work. But yeah,
me too.
Impressive. Yeah. So we'll invite you back so you can keep us posted.
Sounds good. Thank you for the opportunity to present, and thank you to the attendees for your interest.
All right, with that, I am going to stop recording. Thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.